CBS World News brings you the early morning reports of its correspondents at home and abroad. Here are the highlights of the biggest news received up to 8 a.m. Eastern Wartime, Monday, October 19th. Flying fortresses attack big jet flotilla in northern Solomon. Russians yield city block to Germans in Stalingrad. Germans tighten control over shipping using Norwegian ports. Churchill warns British against expected big German air raids. Now, here is Jay Sims. Before calling in Australia, here are the latest reports from the Mediterranean. Cairo's latest communique reports that 1,400 Axis aerial sorties were carried out against Malta last week. British interceptors and anti-aircraft guns shot down nearly 120 Axis aircraft over that island fortress in the past 7 days. 8 enemy bombers were destroyed there Saturday, and the British lost only 3 aircraft in all operations in the Mediterranean theater on that day. Sustained Axis raids on Malta usually mean the Nazis and Italians are running convoys to North Africa past the island base. All signs indicate that the Axis forces in the western desert are being heavily reinforced for a renewal of land fighting expected soon. In the air over the desert front, RAF fighters strafed Axis land transports on the road between Sollum and Sidi Barani. Now for our reports from overseas, we hear first from the Southwest Pacific. After a brief pause, we take you to CBS Australia, William J. Dunn reporting.
The Saturday night raids on Buin, advanced Japanese base at the southeastern tip of Bougainville Island, represent the biggest single blow struck from the Southwest Pacific area in support of the Solomons operations, excepting only those directed at Rabaul early last week. From today's communique at General MacArthur's headquarters, it is obvious that the Allies have located at least a major portion of the Japanese attacking force. And at this portion, 48 hours ago, was still nearly 300 miles from Guadalcanal. Buin is located near the Shortland Islands, where a large enemy convoy was sighted last week, but it is 2 miles further from the scene of actual fighting. The attacks on Buin also represent the third consecutive night's operation against this base, which seems to be growing in importance as the situation in the Solomons grows more tense. Although the point has not been confirmed, it appears probable that Buin is the naval base from which the Japanese have been operating their hit-run attacks on marine positions. Jap warships operating at high speed could cover the somewhat less than 300 miles between sundown and dawn, or, as has been the case, time the run shows the last 100 miles or so to and from their target, and including the actual attack, could be made under cover of darkness. There is no doubt that the American Air Arm operating from Guadalcanal has done an amazing piece of work in the past 2 weeks, but it appears that defensive operations, close to the actual Guadalcanal base, have limited these airmen from pursuing the enemy at long range consistently and effectively. A few more major raids on Buin from New Guinea bases should go far toward discouraging further enemy efforts to maintain a large or even a small naval unit at that point. And each time we force the enemy to seek new bases, even minor ones, we force him to revise his program and retard his effectiveness to some degree. The battle for the Solomons has pushed Europe into comparative obscurity in the Australian press during the past few days, and this is unusual. Australia has always been keenly aware of the battle tide in Europe and the Middle East. This is William J. Dunn in Australia. I return you to CBS in New York.
That was William J. Dunn with the news from Australia. Back in New York, next to the Soviet capital, we take you to CBS Moscow, Larry Lasser reporting.
Completely recovered from their attack of bronchitis. The announcement comes just after the average.
The official call for the immediate trial and punishment of Rudolf Hess is rising in Moscow. Today, the Russian public heard over the radio and in the editorial of Pravda a question leveled at their British ally. Who is Hess? Asked Pravda. A criminal who should be put on trial and punished, or a plenipotentiary representative of the Hitlerian government in England, who enjoys inviolability? This must be finally established, said Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party. In a scorching editorial, the newspaper Pravda said it was not accidental that Rudolf Hess's wife published an appeal to some English representatives demanding that she be brought to her husband in England. It can be seen, said Pravda, that Frau Hess does not consider her husband a war prisoner at all. Pravda says it's impossible to agree with the opinion of some English public statesmen that there are two sides to the question whether the trial of captured Hitlerian chieftains should be held now or later. Pravda says that judging by the discussions in the English press, it would appear that because Rudolf Hess arrived in England wearing the uniform of the Luftwaffe, he could allegedly hope to hide himself from the court of the International Tribunal and thus transform England into a sanctuary for gangsters. It's quite impossible, said the Soviet newspaper, to agree with such discussions. Pravda said if we take into consideration the circumstance under which Hess arrived in England, it's difficult to recognize him as a war prisoner. But even if it's possible to recognize Rudolf Hess as a war prisoner, declares Pravda, there's no international convention about war prisoners preventing them from being tried for terrible crimes. It's impossible, said Pravda, not to agree with President Roosevelt on the necessity for punishing the Nazi leaders concretely responsible for numerous acts of ferocity. Pravda adds that in Roosevelt's statement, nothing was said about delaying the punishment of the criminal Nazi leaders. Rather, the contrary. You must remember that Stalin said last November 6th that Hess was sent to England by the German fascists precisely in order to persuade the English statesmen to join a universal campaign against Soviet Russia. Meanwhile, the Battle of Stalingrad blazes at white heat, and today the Red Army defenders are wearily warding off the ceaseless German attacks. This is Larry Lasser returning you now to Columbia in New York.
That was Moscow. Now, for news from the British capital, we take you to CBS London. Bill Downs reporting.
German raiders dropped bombs at 3 points in eastern England in daylight today. The attacks were scattered. There have been no reports of casualties or damage yet, but because of the small number of bombers involved, it is not believed the German attacks were very effective. London's air raid sirens have been busier today than at any time during the past year. The sirens have wailed out 3 warnings so far this morning. It was almost like old times, such as we had during the Battle of Britain. Londoners have long since given up paying any attention to air raid warnings, but they actually felt pretty good about the series of alerts this morning. They knew that Hitler had been stung into replying to the daylight raids the American and British Air Forces have been making on Europe. Thus far, the Luftwaffe's reprisal raids have been very small. Nothing compared to the fortress attack on Lille last week or the British attack on the Schneider Works in France last Saturday. I was down at an American Army Air Headquarters yesterday. The American pilots are almost as proud of the RAF's big raid on the Schneider Armament Works as if they had done the job themselves. The United States pilots feel that, in a way, they had a very large part in the raid. They explained that, in the first place, our flying fortresses proved that Europe can be raided in daylight. In the second place, they also feel that the fortresses shot down or damaged 105 planes on the Lille raid last week, and Hitler's fighter force in the West was seriously weakened. But there's no question of the Americans trying to steal British thunder. The Schneider raid was an all-British job. The announcement in New Delhi that General Auchinleck will soon be assigned to a new post in the British military machine has this country's unofficial deep thinkers and second-guessers working overtime. You remember General Auchinleck was relieved of his Egypt command last September 8th. Since that time, he has been on leave in India. It is reported here that Auchinleck didn't take his leave in India for nothing. Some speculation says he will remain there and take over the projected Burma campaign. Other reports have it that Auchinleck might replace General Wavell, who will take on other duties. And there is another report that General Auchinleck might even be appointed new Viceroy of India. None of these reports have any official backing in London. And meanwhile, the problem of who will assume supreme command of the Western Front still hangs fire. An incident completely without significance for a change occurred this morning in the Ministry of Information. An American reporter was seen running down one of the ministry's long corridors. A British reporter stopped him and asked where he was going. Nowhere, the American reporter replied, all out of breath. I'm just in training. Mrs. Roosevelt's coming to town. And this is Bill Downs returning you to CBS, New York.
And that was the news from London. Now for news of our own nation's capital, we take you to CBS Washington, John Purcell reporting.
The Office of War Information has issued a report this morning on the performance of American planes. It isn't lyrical in tone. It emphasizes the aviation maxim that you've got to sacrifice some advantages to gain others. But on the whole, it presents an optimistic picture of the worthiness of our aerial fighting craft. Here are the good points. For daylight precision bombing, our flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators are in a class by themselves. These planes have surpassed all expectations in raids over occupied France. Our medium bombers have no competitors, and the latest Navy fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes are the best carrier-based planes in the world. The OWI contends that U.S. fighter planes now in action have many good points, but are definitely inferior to British and German craft in high-altitude combat. However, these same ships have proven themselves in Russia and in northern Africa, where low flying in cooperation with ground forces is necessary. Two new fighter types, the P-38 and the P-47, are in production and show great promise as high-altitude pursuit planes. But neither has been tested adequately in battle. The OWI added that aircraft now under development shows sensational promise of battle performance. The survey was made as the result of confusing reports concerning American planes, and the final conclusion is that the truth lies between the two extremes of favorable and unfavorable criticism. But the OWI definitely scotched the theory of the Japanese Zero's superiority in combat. It's spectacular as a fighting machine, the report says, but deficient as a fighter. And in the Solomons, the 0 hour is close at hand. The latest Navy communique reports that the Japs are still bombing the airfield and shore positions on Guadalcanal. American and Jap troops are being deployed for the showdown battle. No word as yet on our naval units. The Navy reports a heavy concentration of enemy ships in the Shortland Island area. This is John Purcell in Washington, returning you to CBS in New York.
The Tokyo radio today threatened what it called severe punishment for American airmen shot down while bombing Japanese-controlled territory. It implied that the punishment will be death. This enemy announcement, contrary to all agreement among civilized nations as to the treatment of war prisoners, leads observers to believe the Japs fear a repetition of Jimmy Doolittle's famous raid on Tokyo and other cities last April. And it also appears to reflect the heavy pounding the Japs are taking from our bombers at Kiska and in the Southwest Pacific. And that's the story from the enemy. Topping the list of stories on the unrest behind Hitler's lines this morning is a Reuters news agency dispatch from Sweden, which underscores German fears of a possible Allied invasion of occupied Norway. The report says the Nazis have put into effect a new measure providing that all ships entering or leaving the Norwegian port of Stavanger be subject to what is called very strict control. Stavanger is the principal port on Norway's southwest coast. It's almost directly across the North Sea from northern Scotland, some 300 miles away. Another Reuters dispatch reaching London from Stockholm, so far unconfirmed, says the Nazis have begun arresting all Americans in Norway. The United Nations, meantime, are exploiting all Berlin's fears of an Allied offensive in Western Europe. The Netherlands government in exile a few hours ago broadcast a warning to Dutch citizens to use railways and other means of transport as little as possible. It was predicted that the transport system will be subjected to heavy Allied bombing attacks soon, and the Dutch populace was warned to keep out of danger zones and to face increased difficulties which will confront them with patience. Earlier, the Dutch news service Annetta reported that the Germans in Holland have ordered the evacuation of extensive regions along the Dutch coast and in the vicinity of Nazi fortifications.